Hi, this is Emily, and I have a small housekeeping note before we get started with our episode today. At one point in this episode, you might detect a brief change in how the audio sounds. That's because we recorded a tiny portion of our interview with our guest remotely, rather than here in the studio. So I just wanted to give a heads up on that, and thank you for your understanding. Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today we'll be exploring some of the challenges facing Jewish charities following a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in the UK this year. To recall just a couple, 4 ambulances belonging to the Jewish charity the Hatzolah Northwest Trust were destroyed in an arson attack in North London in March. And in April, 2 Jewish men were stabbed in Golders Green, also in North London. So in this episode, we'll be asking how the day-to-day operations of Jewish charities are being affected, and not just those high-profile examples that made it into the headlines. We'll also be finding out how it feels to be a Jewish charity leader in the UK in 2026.
We're joined for this discussion by Jo Grose, Chief Executive of the United Synagogue, a charity that comprises 56 synagogue communities and provides support to multiple aspects of Jewish life, from kosher food licensing to education. Hi Jo, it's so nice to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
At the end of April, a teenage boy pleaded guilty to committing an arson attack at a synagogue in Kenton, which is part of the United Synagogue family. How have these recent attacks on the Jewish community affected the day-to-day running of your charity?
So I think the first thing to say is that although it was a shock, and I'll speak more about what actually happened on the day of the Kenton attack later on, although it was a shock, none of this was a surprise. So sadly, we've been preparing for something like this for some years. Many of our buildings, that's our synagogues and our offices, already have the protective film on the windows. They have airlock doors. They have security guards outside, CCTV. And we have a well-defined emergency response process. So in many ways, we had everything in place. And the building itself actually was protected. The reason that the arson didn't take hold is because it had all of that security infrastructure in place. So I think the easiest way to illustrate the impact on the charity is to talk about the kind of dilemmas that present themselves. So, for example, with the ratcheting up of fear in the community, and I should say there are probably 2 responses to what's happened. There's an increase in fear that people are more nervous to show Jewish symbols in public. Some of them are taking off their kippot, their skull caps. Some of them are taking off their Star of David. That's one position. And then the other position is one of defiance. And people are absolutely wearing their Stars of David and going out onto the street. With that in mind, there are dilemmas that are facing us day to day. So, for example, in the summer, we run summer camps for hundreds and hundreds of children. The good news is there are more people on these camps than ever before. So that's interesting for us as a charity, and we're very pleased to be able to offer that provision. But then there are small things within that. So normally, you gather all your kids at the bus stop, or you take them out to Alton Towers or whatever we do, and they wear a camp T-shirt, Star of David's on it, the name of our youth movement on it. And parents have been in touch to say, you know what, I'm not so comfortable that my child should be wearing an openly Jewish T-shirt on the street. And for the very first time, we've had to consider, do we now have an external T-shirt, which makes no reference to this being a Jewish summer camp, and an internal T-shirt where we can all be loud and proud, but behind closed doors? Or another example is I actually spoke to somebody who works in one of our nurseries. Every year they take their little children on a little bus trip around and about to the shops and back again. And for the first time this year, they've decided that they need to consider whether they take a security guard with them. And actually, with real reason, because a couple of days ago, there were some school children who suffered verbal abuse in Golders Green on a bus. These are the things that are presenting themselves in our risk assessment. So overall, as a charity leader, we're doing more risk assessments. Operationally, we're kind of moving into crisis management, and our trustees are having to consider all the time what we should be saying publicly, who we invite onto our sites, how we manage our public profile it's been complex.
And there are so many different stakeholders that you need to consider. You mentioned children on summer camp, but as a charity chief executive, you've got staff, you've got volunteers, you've got other service users who you need to consider. I was very interested to hear that you already had so much security in place before that attack on one of your synagogues. Could you give a little bit more detail as to what has changed in your day-to-day running in the form of perhaps an emergency response plan?
Absolutely. It has felt, I have to say, a little like COVID this period. I was actually, for better or worse, responsible for the management of COVID across the charity a few years ago. And what we're doing now, this endless response to external factors, is very reminiscent of that action logs and changes all of the time. So we have about 900 staff, we have thousands of volunteers, and obviously thousands and thousands of stakeholders and members. And so the priority has to be, how do we keep all of these people safe, and how do you prioritise that? So again, the risk assessment work has been intense. The kinds of questions we're asking ourselves are rabbis safe to be walking around their area alone? Should we be putting CCTV in rabbinic houses? And actually we are now putting cameras on all of our rabbinic homes, so where families live. What should we be doing for people who are living on site to protect them? Which volunteers are most at risk? We have volunteers who move in and out of our sites late at night. How should we be protecting them? And then much more practical things, like we've stopped advertising the location of any of our events. It's very difficult to effectively promote your events when you have to give an email address for the location. And websites are being shut down. We're much more careful about comms in general. So there's been significant change, and it keeps rolling, so that on yesterday's directors meeting agenda, we had to add the Iran-Israel war, because the implications of that are immediately significant to us. There will be immediate implications of that to our people, our security measures, and so on.
I think it's a really interesting parallel that you've drawn there with the COVID-19 pandemic, because so many organisations, every organisation really across the sector, had to move into that state of emergency response for that period. It's something that I'm sure will resonate with the people who are listening. Being in that constant state of emergency response planning and having to be constantly reacting to these external forces, how does that affect your longer term strategy planning as an organisation, living in this very uncertain, very febrile time?
It's a great question. And I think it's quite well illustrated by what happened on the day of the Kenton attack. So actually, I'm sure as many of your listeners will recognise, I had spent months preparing for a strategy day for our trustees. This was going to be the key day of the year. We'd had some turnaround in our trustees, and we were going to sit down and map out the strategy and the priorities for the next few years. We'd done lots of preparatory work with my colleagues, with staff, and everything was ready. It was a Sunday. I went to bed early that Saturday night and woke up in the morning at 6. The plan was for me to prepare my opening speech for this day, to galvanise everyone and remind them this was a terribly, terribly important time. And I looked at my phone at 6 o'clock, and my amazing colleague had been up all night dealing with the Kenton attack. And it was actually a moment that required some clarity of thought, actually, because we needed to work out what we needed to do, how to make sure that we kept everyone safe, how we managed the media, what it meant for all of our other sites, our stakeholders. We have so many different stakeholder groups, including all of our volunteers and lay leaders who run other synagogues and sites who were very anxious at that time. We held an in-person emergency response team meeting, and then we moved into the other room with our trustees. And we agreed collectively that everyone but 2 people would turn off their phones so that we could still do the strategy piece. And I do commend my colleagues and trustees who managed to do a day of forward planning in the context of there being hordes of people outside Kenton Synagogue and lots of anxiety out of the room. But what it means kind of more seriously is that there are a few things. Funding is diverted, so you can set all the budgets you like. We already spend over £1 million a year on security beyond the grants that are given. That's directed away from, obviously, the areas that we'd like to invest in and that allow us to deliver on our charitable objects. now we need to spend more. And I don't really know where it's coming from. Then we have things like, what do our rabbis and our female religious leaders, what do they need to have in mind now? Suddenly our training and development plan for them has changed to include more on disaster recovery, on managing complexity, on bridge building with other communities, on media, because all of a sudden our rabbis were all over TV and we hadn't really invested so much in that before. There hadn't been a need for it. So we've had to divert. And I'm still running the strategy process that I kicked off that day, but we're just moving much more slowly. Yeah.
But your long-term vision planning and stuff hasn't been unduly affected.
Do you know how it's been altered, actually? It's been altered a bit because the language of the Jewish community at the moment has turned into one of the British Jewish community, has turned a little into one of defiance and anger and a bit of fear. We've done more public affairs than we ever would have done. That wasn't really within the remit of the United Synagogue before. We're very grateful we have representative bodies who do that, but it's become necessary to do more external affairs, so that has shifted. And we've also shifted more generally our strategy to realise that what we need to be delivering now is a type of Jewish provision that is kind of bold and confident and relentlessly positive about what it means to be a British Jew. So yes, it's so far away from business as usual, and we're still under the same financial constraints as we were at the beginning of the year. We've still got to cut our cloth accordingly, but actually it looks very different. And as a sidebar to that, there is another narrative that says, how long have British Jews got here? There are numbers of British Jews moving to other countries. It's rising slowly, but we feel it. It potentially creates a problem in our leadership pipeline. So on the one hand, we're moving ahead. Our strategy of today looks very different to the one we would have spoken about 3 years ago.
And has there been any impact on your fundraising activities?
Yes, in different ways. To speak to the point I just made, if there's an insecurity about the future of the British Jewish community, then donors are going to be cautious about investing in, let's say, long-term capital projects, which is part of what we do. We build community hubs, which allow for all kinds of activity to take place, address social isolation, and so on and so on. If there is a flicker of insecurity in a donor's mind that the Jewish community won't be so strong, they might be asking us harder questions. Now, I've got a lot to say on that, and I can give a very robust defence, and many people have heard me give that already, but that exists. Similarly, people who might otherwise have been funding positive Jewish life are now determining that it's more useful for them to be fighting anti-Jewish hatred in wider society, funding efforts to combat lawfare or to support students on campus. All of these are worthy activities, but they take away from our work. The positive is that the community feels very engaged. Our crowdfunding has been stronger than ever. People feel collectively responsible. We always run a campaign in the spring to fund our welfare activity and the work we do beyond the Jewish community with asylum seekers and supporting British families in need. And that was it was stronger than ever. Yeah.
You've spoken really eloquently there about the impact on your organisation, about the impact on the wider community that you serve over the past couple of years. On a personal level, I wonder, how have you found the voluntary sector as a space to operate in over the past 2 to 3 years as a Jewish charity leader? Have you felt that change on a personal level as well?
So I'm really proud to work for the voluntary sector, and I've got brilliant connections there, amazing mentors, and I've grown within it. And how lucky, how privileged am I to work in a values-driven sector? First point. The second point is that there has been a growing discomfort over the last few years, since October the 7th. I can only speak for myself, so I am not here speaking for all Jews in the charitable sector. But for myself, there's been a growing discomfort that there's been within the sector a particular view, and that the Jewish perspective on what's been going on over the last 3 years hasn't really been invited, and it hasn't always felt as welcoming as it could be. I particularly felt it, and I know some of my colleagues in the Jewish charitable sector felt that there has been a silence around the period, particularly most recently, when there's been a spate of anti-Semitic attacks, and they have been anti-Semitic attacks. There is nothing that is geopolitical about an attack on a person walking down the street in Golders Green. There was relative silence, or there was silence for quite a long time from colleagues from anti-racism charities, and we looked around and wondered why this didn't count. Now, I don't know why that is. I can't answer that question. I wonder whether it's because there's a perception that the Jewish community is privileged in some way, that we don't really feel the racism. But if you look at police hate crime figures, we do. And it's happening. So there has been a discomfort. And I would like to reference my amazing colleague, Sam Clifford, who leads the Jewish Women's Aid charity, who has recently done something which I could learn from. Rather than bemoan the silence or talk about discomfort, she has invited her colleagues from the violence against women and girls sector to sign an open letter condemning anti-Semitism, making it clear that Jewish women are welcome as service users, speaking out about anti-Jewish hatred. And she got 80 signatories. And so I'd like to recognise that happened. It was very fortifying for the rest of us. And actually, it's taught me something, that actually sometimes the challenge is to issue an invitation. And perhaps that's part of the reason why today you're giving me that opportunity also to issue an invitation. So it hasn't felt great, but there are some promising signs. Yeah.
And I understand that you have felt some discomfort around some statements made in the past few months about social issues that are purporting to represent the sector as a whole, and that some of those statements have been problematic for Jewish charities, or perhaps Jewish charities and the people working for them haven't necessarily felt 100% aligned with those statements, and therefore don't feel that they're necessarily being represented in the way that the people issuing these statements might want to portray. I appreciate that sounds very cryptic. So I would be very grateful to hear your thoughts on that, and sort of specific examples of where you felt that people have been speaking on your behalf, but it hasn't been the message that you've necessarily wanted to get out.
At the beginning of the year, following the spate of anti-Semitic attacks, following the Hatzalah ambulances, the arson attacks on charity premises and on synagogues, and to be clear, before Golders Green, when of course there was an attack on a Muslim individual, at that time there were statements put out by sector leaders, and we were grateful for that allyship. But some of those statements also referenced fears within the Muslim communities, as though it's necessary to provide balance or qualification.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why it is that you considered those statements to be problematic?
The first thing is that an attack, as I said earlier, on a Jew on the street or on a synagogue and a place of worship is not in itself a political act or a statement about something that's happening in the Middle East. And those statements felt a little absurd. First of all, after Southport and the wave of Islamophobia that happened after Southport, it was so dreadful for all of our society. And by the way, we can see also the terrible things that are happening in Southampton now and with the Sikh community. And we're in such a febrile environment that I know many, many of us are very uncomfortable with. But after Southport, first of all, we all reached out, I'm sure, to our Muslim neighbours, colleagues, people in the sector. And I know that my Jewish colleagues did that too. There was a huge societal effort to bridge build. At that moment, it would have been absurd for someone to have issued a statement to have said, and we stand with our Muslim neighbours or our Muslim colleagues, and at the same time, we also think about our Jewish colleagues. That would have been bonkers. I couldn't understand why we were doing the same here. I also didn't understand why we were only referencing Muslim charities. Now, we'll come back to this so that nothing that I say is misinterpreted. We're part of the faith sector. So if you wanted to pull us out, single out something in the charity sector, then the best thing to do is refer to us as a faith charity and the thinking of all charities, because an attack on a place of worship could create anxiety for everyone who's in a place of worship. And so it again felt as if anti-Semitism we can only talk about it in its widest geopolitical context and not simply as hatred of other British people on the streets. I would like to make really clear, so that nothing is misunderstood, that interfaith work and bridge building is critical, that it's been a difficult time for relations between the Jewish community and the Muslim community, but we're endlessly optimistic about it and positive about reaching out, and we have good relationships, but there's a lot more work to be done. And actually, I think if there's a theme of the place we find ourselves in at the moment, which is a really fragmented society, there's some really hard work to be done, I think, for all groups in having difficult conversations and listening to one another. And maybe one of those things about the statements don't successfully convey the necessary nuance.
And this is something that was actually addressed by Julia Unwin, the new chair of the Charity Commission, in her first speech as the chair of the regulator, which she gave at the end of April. She talked at length in this speech about how charities handle respect and how they handle positive, constructive dialogue in the face of disagreement, in the face of these great external pressures which are impacting the sector. I think this is a speech that really resonated with you. I wonder if you'd like to give us your thoughts on that.
It really did. I think you summarised the way that I felt. I felt very positively about the speech, gave me great confidence. That section of her speech that was really making clear, of course, there's no common view of the charitable sector. We can't say the charitable sector reflects this, thinks this, takes this position. Of course, there should be causes that rub up against one another a bit uncomfortably, and we're going to have to sit in that discomfort. But it really gave me hope that we can talk about our sector in the broadest possible way. We're used to talking about diversity when we talk about our boards. Right? We're all striving to have trustees that take different views and have difficult conversations in the boardroom. Well, we should be confident about reflecting that in our discussions about the charitable sector.
I wonder if it would be helpful if I just read out a short extract of Julia Unwin's speech. I'll start at a section where she talks about the social contract of charity and it requiring all of us to accept that we live in a world with others, and then acknowledging that we live in an age where the platforms we use, the news we consume, and even the communities we choose to belong to increasingly confirm rather than challenge what we already believe. She goes on to say, charities at their best have always pushed against that tendency. They ask us to care about people and causes beyond our immediate horizon. That's what makes them such a precious resource and part of what makes them at times uncomfortable. Those of us in the room to whom she's addressing cannot stop the violent attacks that some charities face from beyond the world of charity, though we can and we must use every opportunity to say how deplorable these attacks are and ensure that action is taken to protect and to prosecute. And we can model within our organisations and in our relationships with other charities and organisations a mature awareness and appreciation of difference, including through the ability to disagree respectfully, to seek to persuade those who have different views rather than attack them. So we need more speeches like that and more of that sentiment from others in the sector, you think?
100%. I thought that was a brilliant speech, and perhaps there's more work for us to do as a sector in taking that forward.
So I wonder, for non-Jewish charity leaders who are listening to this discussion, listening to you today, what's your message about what these leaders in the sector can be doing at the moment to better support their Jewish colleagues at this time?
My first message is thank you for listening and thank you for thinking about it. There are several actions that I'd recommend. The first is if you have Jewish colleagues, and you might not always know that you have Jewish colleagues because, as I said, this phenomenon of there being two reactions has happened in the workplace too. Some people have come forward and set up advocacy or support groups in the workplace, and others have gone very quiet. But if you know that you have Jewish colleagues, in the first instance, just ask them how they are and maybe give them an opportunity to talk about their lived experience in a comfortable way, just like we do with other groups. Because hearing people's stories and hearing about the kinds of situations that they're finding themselves in day to day, which is where we all are. It's where my community is. Day to day, we're making decisions about our safety and considering our place in British society. So I think making the space for people to share that is important. Secondly, of course, making it evident that whatever your charity, whatever service you provide, that your doors are wide open to Jewish service users and finding the right way of doing that. Introducing some anti-Semitism training into either your DEI offering or separately to that, I think would be of value, and there are great providers who can offer that. And then finally, back to the point before, a statement, a very clear statement that says, we stand against anti-Jewish hatred. It doesn't need to be any more complex than that. It doesn't need to be nuanced. It doesn't need to reference world events. It doesn't need to be apologetic. It doesn't need to balance one thing up against another. You just stand against anti-Semitism means an awful lot to colleagues and to Jewish charities in the sector overall.
And just as an extension to Emily's question, again, for you personally, and you're not speaking on behalf of the Jewish community or other Jewish charity leaders, but I wonder if there's anything in addition to what you've just said that would make you feel more at home as a Jewish leader of a charity in the UK voluntary sector.
That's a really interesting question, because I'm going to reference my colleague Sam Clifford again, because I could have said, you know what, nobody reached out to me. Kenton United Synagogue got firebombed, and although some of our synagogues did get notes from their neighbours, nobody reached out and said, hello, want to chat, want a cup of coffee? And I could have answered the question that way. But actually, I just think that perhaps those people who are planning gatherings, convening leaders, planning training, picking up the phone and saying, we're thinking about doing this next year. Is there a perspective that you think Jewish charities would appreciate being addressed? Is there someone from your sector? We don't expect to be everywhere all the time. We're still tiny. The Jewish population, 0.5% of the country. But is there somebody who might be interested to be on a panel? Those, I think, would give us the sense that we're being included and thought about.
And as a final question, I wonder if you could give me any causes for optimism, anything that keeps you hopeful in this current, very febrile, very difficult time in society. What gives you hope?
You know what gives me hope most of all is the work on the ground continues, right? The volunteering continues within the Jewish community and the care that we provide, the religious services that we provide. But just for the purpose of this conversation, let me tell you about the Asylum Seeker Centre that we run in one of our synagogues. We've run it for years now. Every fourth Sunday, the synagogue opens. Volunteers from the synagogue welcome in our visitors, our asylum seeker family visitors, who come, yes, to benefit from the services and a hot meal and all the other things that we're able to provide. But more than that, they come with their kids. And every fourth Sunday, a load of Jewish kids play with a load of kids from a ton of different backgrounds, and they meet each month and they're building up real relationships and they're learning from one another. And so if you just want a snapshot of hope, it's Sunday afternoons.
Jo, thank you so much for speaking to us today. We've really appreciated this conversation, and we've appreciated hearing from you.
Thank you so much for giving me the time. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Jo, and that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Jude Owen.